Hello, hello. Welcome to One Wild World, a podcast by The Echo. I'm your host, Matthew Juneau.
And I'm the editor, Mike Davis.
Mike, what was one of your favorite jobs that you've had?
Well, I've really enjoyed working as a music producer for friends and local bands.
Why is that your favorite?
Well, I'm very passionate about music, and I have produced a lot of my own music throughout my life. So I think that puts me in a really good position to offer a relatable perspective to my clients and communicate with them in a way that allows me to capture the best possible performances from them. And thus, the end result is a great recording that can be released out into the world with confidence for everyone to listen to.
That does sound really nice. And I think that showing people off in the best light is something that's not only really nice to do and something that you've been doing in that job, but that's also something that we try to do with the podcast and all the guests that we feature here.
Definitely. So, what was one of your favorite jobs?
One of mine was when I worked with environmental education rangers at Rocky Mountain National Park. And I took student groups aged from pre-K all the way up to college and then even senior citizens on engaging field trips in the park for up to a couple of hours. One of my favorite parts of the trips during the winter was that the visitors could even finish the trip by riding down a slide made of snow.
That sounds like a really fun way to end a trip to a national park.
Totally. And it always was nice to remind people that the national parks are a place to be enjoyed. At the start of each of these trips, I would often tell the groups that in order to go down this slide at the end, I was either going to quiz them or accept a piece of trash that they found and picked up while in the park. And it was kind of sad to see that even in a national park, there were pieces of trash there. But it provided a really good opportunity to reinforce the leave no trace mentality with my groups.
That is really nice to encourage the leave no trace principles. But yeah, it is really sad how much damage littering can cause and how far trash can be carried from its source.
Right? It's really upsetting, especially when you consider microtrash and just how pervasive that is. Unfortunately, there were always plenty of visitors who got to use their trash as the price to ride down the slide. I actually still play a little game where I try to find at least one piece per trip when I go outdoors, and it's something that I encourage listeners to play along with when you get outdoors. Speaking of little games, I think it's about time for another round of
What's That Animal?
One thing that I love about What's That Animal is that one sound can yield an array of different answers. Sometimes we can only identify the general type of animal, such as cat, dog, bird, or bug. And other times we might be trying to ID a specific species. It's always good to start with at least the type of animal for the first time you hear the sound, and then narrow it down on the second and third listens. Try to use this strategy this round. So for the first time, here's the sound. There are many animals like this one, so it might be a tricky round for some of you. To help you narrow it down or confirm it, here's the sound one more time. This is quite a tough one. Stick around for one more chance to listen and lock in your final guess at the end of the episode. Today, we're joined by Kate Boyd. She's the president of the Northern Colorado Herpetological Society, as well as a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. Kate provides education and outreach for her community and even fosters wildlife patients independently. Let's head over to my conversation with her now. Just a little bit of breakdown for some of our viewers who might not know. What is herpetology? How's that breakdown? What's that mean?
Herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians. And so as the Herpetological Society, We started back in 2015, is when we all got together, as sort of a good place for a group of people to talk about captive reptiles and amphibians that they had owned, and also how to promote both respect and education for them in our local community. So our group, we work with reptiles and amphibians, and we work to educate the public about those animals, both the ones that we have natively and also just around the globe. And then it kind of evolved a little bit. It started out as more of the education, and over time, as more folks got to know us a little bit and heard about us, we got a lot of requests to take in animals that people couldn't keep anymore. So that's where we kind of started to get into the rescue side of things, and we became a fully licensed rescue through the state of Colorado. And so we're all foster-based, and we take in animals that people can no longer care for, or occasionally we get animals transferred to us from different organizations, for example, the Northern Colorado Wildlife Center. So if an animal gets brought into their care that cannot be released for whatever reason, so maybe they have an injury that would make it so that they wouldn't survive or wouldn't have a good enough quality of life in the wild, but they could have that in captivity. They can transfer those animals to us, and we can find them an adoptive home that can give them what they need, even though it's not quite back into the wild where we would hope that they could go.
Awesome. A lot of really important work that you all do. Have you always loved reptiles, or when did that start for you in your journey?
I've been obsessed with all sorts of animals since as long as I can remember. I was taking in little injured rabbits that I could find in my neighborhood and trying to care for them overnight before being able to take them where they need to go for a rehabilitation. And so I've been interested in all sorts of different kinds of animals. I was never allowed to have any snakes in the house as a kid. My dad was just terrified of them. He would freak out if he knew that there was even one in the yard. So I had a lot of fun finding them outside and experiencing them. I always had that extra want to be able to bring them into the home too, because maybe a little bit of it was I knew I never could. So I started to go for my degree in zoology. Through that, I started an internship at a reptile and amphibian zoo in Minnesota. And that was kind of my hooking moment where I just became obsessed with these animals. They're just really interesting to get to know the personalities of. I think a lot of people see reptiles as these instinct-only creatures, and more research that comes out, we're finding that is just absolutely the furthest from the truth. These animals do have social bonds and social structures that are very equal to a lot of mammal species that people have that kind of personal connection with.
That's a really interesting point that you touched on, because lots of people own dogs and cats, and then as a result, they can kind of see the intelligence or emotional intelligence of those animals. I often hear people talk about, oh, well, I came home and my dog got into the trash, and you should have seen the guilty look that my dog had, or you can really tell when your dog's super happy or things like that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, in your experience, something that's surprised you with the intelligence of either reptiles or amphibians that you've seen.
The biggest turning point for me was working in that zoo. They had an Asian water monitor, and he was just the coolest critter I think I've ever interacted with. And it really felt like you could just see his brain thinking. I would provide him with enrichment where we take him out of his enclosure for cleaning, and then as we're putting everything back together, we would take hard-boiled eggs and hide them in different spots in the enclosure. And to see him think and to kind of do that problem-solving process, to be able to find these, and the way he would interact with people when they would come up to the enclosure, or how different it would be when we would interact versus the general public, you could really see that there was a big difference there. And I think that was kind of a big turning point for me. And I think lizards are probably one of the easier groups of the reptiles and amphibians to get a read on their behavior, and at least it kind of feels like we can understand them a little bit easier than, for example, snakes. They don't have eyebrows or even eyelids or ears, the things that we look out for in other animals. So it's really kind of a challenge, and I take it as a fun challenge to be able to try and understand their behavior a little bit.
Yeah, that's one thing that I always, when people talk about, often I hear it as the caveman part of our brain or the lizard part of our brain, like our basal functions. And then I think about that sometimes and I'm like, but lizards do some really incredible things. Like, we're discounting lizards when we talk about them that way. And so it's really interesting to hear you talk about hiding hard-boiled eggs all over the place. I feel like lots of animals get some really good enrichment from things like that, from finding food. Can you tell us a little bit about Northern Colorado Herpetological Society and sort of your goals with it now?
Yeah. It started back in 2015 as just a group of folks who wanted to get together to share their passion about both the animals that they had owned and also seeing different native species for reptiles and amphibians in our area. And it slowly grew and evolved from there. And it kind of took a turn away from more of a social group and turned into more of a educational and rescue nonprofit. It just evolved that way based on the needs that it seemed like our community had. It's been awesome to be able to grow and to be able to expand our education programs and really see that change in the community for how they kind of view reptiles and amphibians. That's one of the biggest things that we want to share with people, is just that they deserve respect and that they are really important for our ecosystems. Just like we were talking about, that whole notion of a caveman/lizard brain isn't really as true as people had thought. So that's our main focus. And the other half has become somewhat of just the rescue. So taking in animals into our care that people either don't know how to care for or just don't have the means to anymore. With reptiles and amphibians, their lifespans are very long for captive animals compared to what a lot of people are used to with our dogs and cats and hamsters and things. So those kind of timelines, which is around 10 to 20 years most of the time, versus some of our turtles and tortoises and snakes that live upwards into their 50s and 80s and beyond even sometimes, can be a real challenge. People can't plan that far ahead all the time. So we want to be there to be able to help those animals, to be able to have that knowledge about the specific care that they need when there's so many different species from all across the world that we need to replicate a little bit of their natural environment to be able to care for properly. So there's a lot of little details that go into it that a lot of folks just aren't prepared for. So we want to be able to help out with that.
Yeah, and I know your website is a great resource for not only just the rescue side of things, but as well that education. And you mentioned this a little bit before, that your dad wasn't always a fan of you bringing home snakes to have in the house. How, when you're doing that education, do you work with trying to get people to appreciate reptiles and amphibians and break down that barrier between them?
I think a lot of that comes down to familiarity and a little bit of practice. So we have animal ambassadors that come with us to pretty much all of our education programs, and having not only just that physical connection of seeing that animal in real life, it's not just another documentary on a screen, but being able to interact with that animal up close. I think that helps to bridge the gap a lot. We do outreach programs that are family friendly, so we get tiny, tiny children all the way up to grandparent ages. We see all these little kids, they rush up because they don't have this predisposed fear of these animals. So they come up, they interact with these animals that are trained to be calm and easy to handle. And then a lot of times at those programs, it's kind of funny, the older adults, they're the ones that are standing 40 to 50 feet away from this little snake that's puddled down, and their toddlers are coming up to gently pet them. And over time, they see that and they're like, oh, okay, if that little kid can handle petting it, maybe I can work up to that too. Maybe it's not so scary. That thing that I have in my brain about just being instantly afraid of them, maybe I can challenge that a little bit. And so that's one of the ways that we make that connection. And I think that's been helping a lot. It's one of my favorite things to see at our education programs, is folks who go from that initial very scared instinct fear up to being able to come up and either pet the animal or just being okay with it in their space is really important.
Yeah, I think reaching children is one of the best ways to get people to appreciate, because like you said, that fear or the value hasn't really been placed yet. So if you can do a little bit of education and get them to appreciate and understand this animal, that's what leads, ultimately to a respect for them, and then down the line helps you care for them. What kind of animal ambassadors do you use, and do you find most effective for reaching children?
We have a variety of different animal ambassadors that we bring with to education programs. We try to have at least one animal from a couple different groups. So we have a couple lizards, a few snakes, a few turtles and tortoises, as well as our little tree frogs for our amphibians. And all of these animals came to us from a rescue situation one way or another. And so that's another part of how we can educate, is we can talk about how those animals came to us. So we have ball pythons, we have king snakes, bearded dragons, we have a green iguana, we have a ornate box turtle, native species, a hognose snake, another native species, as well as a red-footed tortoise. So those are some of our animal ambassadors that have been trained to come with us to our education programs. But it's a pretty even spread, and we're always excited to be able to have native species with us, but sometimes it's also helpful to have non-native species that we can talk about the global impact of reptiles and amphibians too.
On the topic of having people either appreciate or respect reptiles and lizards, is there anything that comes to your mind as a misconception that people believe about reptiles or amphibians that you want to break down here?
There's a ton of myths out there. One of the biggest ones that I see, and that we're leaning away from it in terms of captive care, which is great. But there is the myth that if you get an animal as a pet, or a family wants to buy this little tiny turtle for their kiddo, if you keep it in a smaller enclosure, it will stay a smaller size because it won't grow outside of that enclosure. But that is totally a myth. I think it's perpetuated a little bit by, if people have animals in a smaller enclosure, usually their other husbandry practices are not so great. So animals can become either stunted or injured or sick, being kept in smaller places, and also because of husbandry practices. So we try and educate folks about increasing space if they do want a captive animal, what captive animals even make good pets, because there are a lot of pet stores that sell animals that should not be pets in captivity. It's very difficult to care for those animals properly. Like iguanas are a great example, one of our animal ambassadors, just because they get so large. They get about 6 feet long, and they can become quite territorial as well if they're not handled properly and there's not a lot of behavior work done with them. So they can become kind of dangerous for people to own in their homes, and they require a lot of space too. About a bedroom's worth of space is what we typically recommend for anybody who's interested in either adopting or having an iguana in their home. But you can buy them at most big commercial pet stores for, I think it's like $40 to $60 for a little baby that's about this long. It's very cute, very small, herbivorous. From just seeing it as it is in the stores, I can see the appeal for sure. But once that animal grows up and starts to need more food and more space, it can become a real problem.
Definitely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of species that people get when they're younger and they're like, oh my gosh, this is precious. I get to have this little tiny thing, and then it starts to get bigger. And that's when people will just abandon animals out into the wild. And then we have all sorts of problems with invasive species and stuff like that. So that's a huge kudos that I give to you, again, with being able to rescue animals and get them to the appropriate places. That's huge. The next section that I want to focus on is something that we do with all of the episodes, where we try to give our listeners ways that they can appreciate animals in their everyday lives. So if people were looking to get started bringing an animal into their house, either a reptile or an amphibian, is there a good species you'd recommend to get started with, or tips that you might have to do so?
Yeah, there's a couple different species that have been bred in captivity consistently enough where a lot of times their behaviors are a little bit easier for folks to handle, and those animals in general seem a little more comfortable. Ball pythons are a great snake species that is a good pet species in captivity. Bearded dragons and leopard geckos are some pretty good lizard species for folks starting out if they're interested in getting involved. Leopard geckos stay very small, so they're usually pretty easy for people to handle and have the space for. As far as like turtles and tortoises, that's where it gets a little more complicated because of their lifespans and their life expectancies being so much longer, that it can be very appealing at first for somebody to want to get a little baby tortoise for their kiddo. But having to have that conversation about planning ahead for what happens when the kiddo goes off to college or moves out, and where's that tortoise going to be, because you will still have it at that point. So it gets a little more complicated there, but Russian tortoises typically stay a little bit on the smaller side, though their life expectancies are still pretty long. But I would say a Russian tortoise would be a pretty good tortoise species for folks.
Awesome. I'm also curious if you have any insight into, especially on the amphibian side of things. I know there's times where I go out and explore natural areas, or even just sometimes in neighborhoods, if it's near water, you can hear frogs ribbiting. Do you have a way to identify like what the ribbits are for certain frogs, or at least what are some of the common species that people might hear in Colorado?
Yeah, some of the most common ones that we can hear around are chorus frogs. Because of their name, they're very vocal a lot of the time. And I definitely don't want to embarrass myself trying to make the sound, but
Do it.
There are some good YouTube videos that are great examples for folks to be able to look up. There's lots of good birding apps that have amazing lists of all the different calls, like the Merlin app is fantastic. But I haven't found one that's a great one for herps yet that have the calls in there. I so wish there was something out there. But the chorus frogs are generally the most common ones that you hear, especially around northern Colorado. You can also pretty commonly hear bullfrogs, so they have that longer, bigger, deep sound that they make for their calls, and they're not very quick about it, like it's kind of spread out for their different calls when they make those. So those are ones that you can more typically hear around our area for sure.
And then if people wanted to go out and look for reptiles or amphibians, I know that Northern Colorado Herpetological Society started, like you said, as a social group. Can you provide any advice for people who want to go out and try to find animals outside?
Yeah. And there is a big community all throughout the state that is pretty focused on herping, kind of like birding. It's the same idea, just going out looking for those animals and trying to experience them in the wild. We offer guided herping hikes, so to speak, where we will go out, we'll look for those animals, we'll point out different signs and different places that you can see them. We try to be a little bit selective about where we're sharing those locations, because unfortunately there are a lot of people that want to go out to find those animals, to poach them, to take them out of the wild, whether that's to keep them as pets or for their own personal animals or whatever. So we do try and be a little bit careful about the specific locations that we're telling people about. But generally speaking, around northern Colorado, anywhere where there's wetlands or marshes are great places to find tons of different species. Just in Fort Collins alone, we have northern water snakes, spiny softshell turtles, painted turtles, snapping turtles. We've got bull snakes, garter snakes, racer snakes. We've got short-horned lizards. We have woodhouses toads. I could go on forever about all the different species that are just right in one little city that you can find. I would say iNaturalist is a really great place, a good resource for folks to be able to look up if they're considering going on a hike somewhere and they want to look out for particularly one certain species or even just see what's in the area. That's one of my favorite things to do is when I'm planning my hike, I find the space I'm going to go and then I look on iNaturalist to see what other people have seen around that area.
I also have iNaturalist and recommend it highly as an app. Not only, like you're saying, is it a good resource for you to be able to see like, oh, I'm going to go to this area. What kind of animals might I keep an eye out for while I'm out there? But there's also something really fun, especially when you get better at identifying animals, about logging your own sightings. And it's kind of fun. I think at this point, I don't have a ton, but every time I do it, I'm so excited of like, oh my gosh, I saw a great horned owl in this tree, and knowing that someone might be able to see that sighting and go out to try to look for that animal is pretty exciting. It's a great app.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
You've talked about trying to be protective of the locations that you use, because while it's not the majority of people that go out there, there is a subset that are trying to fuel either the reptile or exotic animal trade. I'm wondering, because I've seen signs for the Reptile Expo that's coming to Colorado, if you might be able to give some pros that those kind of events have and then some cons that they have as well. Because I think like everything, there's some good that's being done. There's some things that could be done better. So I'm interested in your opinions there.
Yeah, exactly. Everything's even mixed. I haven't personally been to many of those events, so I can't speak too much to how they're run. But I have seen folks go to those events and they see really cool species that they've never experienced before. So just like with what we do with our education programs, being able to make that in-person connection with the animals can be really important, and it can get people really excited, and it can sometimes even start people on their own journeys for becoming biologists, which is really cool, and I think it's really important. There's also, of course, the opposite side of that, where there are a lot of very interesting species that probably shouldn't be there. Animals that don't do well in captivity, or maybe they are endangered in the wild, and there's not a lot of resources to ensure that those animals were bred in captivity and not poached from the wild. We do see that quite a bit with reptiles and amphibians, especially turtles are very susceptible to being poached from the wild, and that causing a lot of issues for them. We're actually taking in quite a few endangered species this week that came from an interesting situation where they should not have been in captivity. So there's situations like that we see all over the place with reptiles and amphibians, and they're just a large group of animals that aren't very heavily regulated on what species are allowed to be owned, which species should. Any kind of permitting that needs to be owned for them is pretty minimal, if there is any at all. So I think that is the other side of those bigger expos, is seeing these animals that probably shouldn't be there, and then folks getting into the mindset of, oh no, this is normal, those animals should be here, they should be in captivity, and that kind of being stuck in the mindset. So it's really awesome to be able to see and experience all those different animals and for people to learn about them, but seeing them in that setting too can also be a little bit detrimental.
A little bit of good, a little bit of bad, but certainly the event isn't solely one or the other, definitely. With Northern Colorado Herpetological Society, what are the best ways that people can support you and your work? I know that the website has some events that people can check out, but what's the best way to support you all?
Yeah, I would say either coming out to any of our public education programs or scheduling education programs with us so that we can educate our community, or adopting and fostering and volunteering are all different ways that people can be involved. There is a pretty big increase in the need for different animals to be adopted recently, especially this past summer. I think that we're seeing an increase with a lot of different things with recession and stuff happening, that a lot of people aren't able to care for their animals anymore. So if people have space in their homes, maybe they were kind of interested, thinking about getting a reptile or amphibian pet, reaching out to us, checking out our adoptable animals, and being able to adopt instead of purchasing from pet stores, whether that's through us or other rescues, is just an awesome way to help out.
Do people need to have any special certifications to either foster animals or, I guess, to adopt as well?
Yeah, no certifications or any strict requirements. So with us and our adoption process, we do it a little bit differently than some places. Some places have an adoption application where you fill out a form and there's certain criteria. We do adoption counseling instead. So with there being so many different species, there's no way we could have just a standard form that you could just fill it out and we'd know exactly if you're going to be a great home or not. So we want to talk to people one-on-one. We want to make sure that for that individual animal in particular, that they really understand the husbandry, the care requirements that go into it, and that also that animal is going to be a good fit for them too, for that animal's particular personality and any sort of different things that that species might have in terms of particular common personality traits, like with the iguanas and them needing a lot of behavioral and social work to be able to be good captive animals and to have it be safe for those owners as well. So we like to talk one-on-one with people to try and figure out and make sure that it's going to be a good fit and how to help them do that too.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you all are a great resource, and that's really good to take that time to, on a one-to-one basis, touch base and make sure that the animal's going to go to a good home. Well, thanks for taking the time and speaking with us today. It was great to get to talk to you.
Yeah, it was awesome talking with you as well.
I gotta say that we've had some amazing people on the show, and it's always a great feeling to add another person to that list. Kate really knows her stuff, and she has a very welcoming and enthusiastic approach to educating people about reptiles and amphibians. She even sent us some footage that was used in today's What's That Animal? Now that we know who the sound came from, let's hear it one more time. So, the sound from Kate's video is the croak of the White's tree frog. These frogs grow to about 3 to 5 inches across and can live up to 16 years old. They represent sort of a standard for a lot of the cartoon frogs that we tend to see in the media, with that classic green skin color. Their thick, waxy skin helps them to tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions and actually makes them a great frog to own as a pet. Not to mention, they're pretty darn cute. Not all frogs, though, are as resilient as the White's tree frog. And this comes back to that impact of the trash and pollution on animal communities. In areas heavily affected by pollution, frogs are found to have almost a 15% decrease in survival and an over 500% increase in abnormal genetics. So, next time you're out in nature, make sure you don't leave anything behind and pick up all the litter you can. Now it's time to get a bit sentimental. This is actually the last round of What's That Animal for season 1. It's been a wild ride, and we've learned a lot about the diversity, or should I say biodiversity, of animal sounds out there. And we've trained our ears to identify these sounds. Even though What's That Animal won't be back till next season, make sure to keep using your ears to identify the animals around you. To finish out this season, next week I'll be having a special conversation with Mike, our editor. We'll be having a fun little recap of the first season, as well as answering some questions from you, the listeners. So keep an eye on our Instagram to get involved. And tune in next week for the season finale of One Wild World. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe and consider supporting us directly at patreon.com/onewildpodcast. Here, you'll find exclusive content, like the full video versions of our conversations. To find out more about the other work we do, visit our website at onewildpodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram at @theechoanimals, and follow our TikTok at creature.feature. On behalf of all animals, thank you for listening.